Hey everybody, what's going on? This is Sam from Historic Travels and welcome to another video. Alright guys, well hey, the time has finally come to conclude the story of the Hindenburg disaster. When we last left the Hindenburg, the airship had just completed its 1936 season and was now beginning to start its 1937 season. Alright guys, well hey, with the intro out of the way, let's now conclude the story of the Hindenburg. After the 1936 season, the Hindenburg wouldn't fly again until March of 1937. Its first flight in 1937 happened on March 11th, and these flights were just basically some testing flights to make sure the ship was still airworthy enough to do its long-haul flights. The Hindenburg's first main flight of the 1937 season was from Frankfurt, Germany, all the way to Rio de Janeiro. The flight went without incident, and then a few days later, the Hindenburg then once again returned to Frankfurt. Now, after this happened, the Hindenburg would remain in Frankfurt for another month, and then, in May of 1937, the Hindenburg would prepare for its next long-haul flight, a flight all the way from Frankfurt, Germany, to New Jersey in the United States. The Hindenburg departed Frankfurt, Germany for Lakehurst, New Jersey on May 3rd, 1937. Now, it's important to note that for the Hindenburg's first trip to the United States of the 1937 season, the ship did not have a full load of passengers on board. The ship was roughly halfway booked for this trip, so it had around 36 passengers on board. However, the ship did have a full complement of crew on board, though, so the ship did have a lot of people on board. Now, for the ship's return flight from the United States to Germany, this trip was fully booked, so it was very important that the Hindenburg arrive in the United States on time. As the Hindenburg crossed the Atlantic, the trip went without any type of major incident. The ship did encounter some very strong headwinds, which did slow the ship down quite a bit, and there was also another small incident where, you see, where the Hindenburg was lifted into the air by hydrogen, the crew was very careful to keep any type of spark away from the hydrogen. Now, the Hindenburg did, believe it or not, have a smoking room. However, this room was pressurized, so no sparks could get out. Now, the minor incident that happened was, you see, a small child had brought a small toy car on board the Hindenburg, and this car, when you push it around on the floor, well, it emitted sparks. And when the crew saw that this car could do that, they quickly took the car away from the child. Now, no major incident happened with this, but it was still something of note that I thought I should tell you all about this trip across the Atlantic. Now, when the Hindenburg did eventually arrive in the United States, the passengers and crew were very much looking forward to landing. However, what the crew and passengers on board the Hindenburg did not yet realize was that they would all be very soon in a massive battle for their lives. 3 days after leaving Frankfurt, the Hindenburg was finally approaching the United States. The ship first made landfall over the city of Boston. It was going to fly over Boston as it headed towards New Jersey. Now, it's important to note that when the Hindenburg reached Boston, the airship was already hours behind schedule due to the very strong headwinds the Hindenburg had encountered over the Atlantic. As the Hindenburg approached Lakehurst, the ship was delayed even further by a series of thunderstorms that was rolling through the area. So, since the conditions were too bad for the Hindenburg to land in Lakehurst at this time, the captain of the Hindenburg decided to take the airship and have it do a flyover of New York City so the ship's passengers could admire New York City below. The Hindenburg would continue to do flybys of New York and New Jersey over the course of the next several hours while it waited for the weather to improve over its landing site. Now, as more and more time went by, the crew on the ground and on board the Hindenburg were getting increasingly desperate because if they did not land soon and drop off the ship's current passengers and pick up the new passengers, then the ship would be late for its return trip to Germany. Then, when the ship was nearly 12 hours late for landing, the Hindenburg finally got the all clear from Lakehurst that the weather conditions had improved enough for the ship to attempt a landing. It was 6:22 p.m. when the Hindenburg finally received the all clear from Lakehurst that it was okay to proceed with the landing. However, it would take the Hindenburg another 40 minutes to return to Lakehurst from where it was currently waiting for the all clear to land. When the Hindenburg approached Lakehurst, the ship was basically going to perform something called a high landing, which basically means the ship's crew was going to bring the Hindenburg to the site that it was going to touch down. However, they were going to approach it at a high altitude, an altitude of roughly 600 to 650 feet or so. Then, once it approached this spot, the ship was going to stop and drop its landing ropes. And then from that point on, it was going to be up to the ground team to use these ropes to pull the Hindenburg down to the ground. The Hindenburg was approaching its landing site at Lakehurst at 7:09 p.m. However, at the very last second, the captain ordered a very sharp turn to port, while the Hindenburg was still moving at near full speed. He did this because he noticed that the ground crew was not in position yet to bring the Hindenburg down to the ground. So his plan was to do a real quick turnaround maneuver, and then hopefully by the time the Hindenburg came back to its landing site, the ground crew would be in position to help bring the Hindenburg down to the ground. 2 minutes later, at 7:11 p.m., the captain of the Hindenburg had the ship turn around and once again approach its landing site. Now, he noticed that as the Hindenburg was approaching the landing site, the ground crew was in position, but the ship was also coming in too fast. So he ordered the Hindenburg's engines to be thrown into reverse in an attempt to stop the airship. However, this was the first time that the crew on the Hindenburg noticed that something seemed to be off with the airship. It seemed like that the Hindenburg was a little bit heavy at the tail, but they were not sure why at this current time. One of the first things the captain of the Hindenburg did in order to try to correct for this initial heaviness in the ship's stern was he ordered some of the water contained within the Hindenburg's ballast tanks to be dropped. Now, this did help with the initial heaviness at the stern a little bit, however, it would not work for very long. A couple of minutes later, at 7:17 p.m., the wind suddenly shifted, and it was threatening to blow the Hindenburg out of position. In order to correct for this, the captain of the Hindenburg ordered a second sharp turn to starboard. Now, these sudden turns the Hindenburg was taking was causing the ship to take a S-shaped flight path towards its final landing site. As the ship grew closer to its landing site, they had to dump more and more water from the ship's ballast tanks because the ship was getting increasingly heavier at the stern. They even tried to vent out some of the hydrogen at the front of the Hindenburg in an effort to try to even out the ship's trim. However, none of these attempts worked for very long. It got so bad that the captain of the Hindenburg even ordered a few crew members who were working at another part of the ship to walk towards the front part of the ship just to add a little bit more weight up there in an attempt to even the ship out. A couple of minutes later, at 7:21 p.m., the Hindenburg was finally in the correct position for landing. The ship dropped its landing ropes, and the ground crew immediately set out to begin pulling the ship down. The port side landing ropes of the Hindenburg were attached to a winch, which began to pull the ship down, and the starboard side landing ropes were pulled down by hand. Now, at the exact same time the ground crew were beginning to pull the Hindenburg down to the ground, a very light rain began to fall on the airfield the Hindenburg was landing at. This rain wasn't enough to cause any problems with the landing. However, the landing ropes the Hindenburg was using were slowly but surely starting to get wet. A couple of minutes after the landing ropes were dropped, one of the members of the ground team noticed something odd going on at the back of the Hindenburg. He said he noticed towards the rear fins of the ship this strange rippling effect that he saw go across the top of the airship. He didn't know 100% what it was at the time, but he definitely thought something unusual was happening with the airship. Then, at 7:25 p.m., on the Hindenburg's bridge, the crew noticed that they thought they could hear this strange rumbling sound coming from somewhere within the Hindenburg. They weren't sure exactly what this sound was at the time, but they assumed that it was the ground winch pulling the Hindenburg down to the ground. Then, suddenly and without warning, the back of the Hindenburg erupted into a massive ball of fire. The ship began to rapidly fall stern first. The sudden motion of the ship knocked everyone inside the Hindenburg off their feet as the back of the Hindenburg fell straight down towards the ground, engulfed in a massive ball of flames. The hydrogen within the Hindenburg was suddenly burning uncontrollably. Now, the hydrogen tanks at the front of the Hindenburg had not yet caught fire. So as the Hindenburg fell, the ship fell stern first, with the top of the Hindenburg sticking straight up into the sky. All of the Hindenburg's passengers and crew that were on the Hindenburg's observation deck began rapidly smashing the windows so they could jump out of the Hindenburg as the ship grew closer and closer to the ground. The back of the Hindenburg hit the ground with a terrific crash, and then the force of the impact caused a massive ball of fire to shoot out of the front of the Hindenburg. Once this happened, the front of the Hindenburg rapidly caught fire, and then the ship's front section began to collapse to the ground. In somewhere between 30 to 40 seconds, the entire airship was consumed into a massive ball of fire. Now, the primary reason why we have so many photos and even video of the Hindenburg disaster was because where this was the airship's first flight to the United States of the 1937 season, it attracted a lot of journalists to the area. Now, one of the most famous pieces of media to come out of the Hindenburg disaster is a radio broadcast by this man, Herbert Morrison. He was recording a radio broadcast that was going to air the next day when the Hindenburg caught fire. I'm going to play a little bit of that radio broadcast for you right now.
It bursts into flames. Get it started. It's fighting, and it's crashing. It's crashing terrible. Oh my, get out of the way, please. It's burning, bursting into flames, and it's falling on the morning fast, and all the folks between it. This is terrible. This is one of the worst catastrophes in the world. Oh, it's like 400 or 500 feet into the sky, and it's a terrific crash, ladies and gentlemen. The smoke and the flames now, and the flame is crashing to the ground, not quite to the mooring mast. All the humanity and all the passengers.
After the Hindenburg had completely crashed to the ground, the emergency response teams wasted no time to try to go out and rescue as many people from the downed airship as possible. Now, this right here is one of the most incredible things about the Hindenburg disaster, is that, believe it or not, most of the people that were on board the Hindenburg did survive the crash. And in case you're wondering how that is possible, well, I'll explain. Now, at the time of the accident, the Hindenburg had 97 people on board. And of that number, 36 would unfortunately lose their lives. Now, don't get me wrong here. This is a great tragedy, and it's awful that this many people died. But the reason that it wasn't worse, well, there are two reasons. Number one, where the airship was very close to landing, most of the people on board the Hindenburg were very close to the windows, so they had a quick means of escape. And the second reason that these people were able to survive was because where it was hydrogen, that was mostly the thing that was burning. Well, you see, where hydrogen goes up as soon as it's released, well, it was pulling the flames up with it. The fire wasn't going down deeper into the ship right away, which is where most of the people on board the Hindenburg were, at the bottom of the ship. So because of this, most of the people who were on board the Hindenburg had a little bit of a window where they could run away from the ship as it was crashing to the ground. This is why the loss of life in the Hindenburg disaster was not a lot worse than what it was. After the Hindenburg disaster, a massive question needed to be answered. What had caused this brand new revolutionary airship to catch fire and collapse to the ground? No one really knew for certain, but there were a lot of theories out there. The most popular theory as to what caused the Hindenburg to catch fire was sabotage. Many people believe that somebody may have planted some type of a device on the Hindenburg that caused the ship to erupt into a massive ball of fire. However, whatever the cause of the Hindenburg disaster was, the man who built the Hindenburg, Hugo Echner, was determined to find out. Now, here's the funny thing about trying to explain exactly what caused the Hindenburg to catch fire. You see, the thing is, even to this day, we do not yet know for certain what caused the Hindenburg to catch fire as it was landing. There is a very popular theory out there, which I will explain in a minute, but the reason why we can't say for certain is that most of the evidence burned up when the Hindenburg crashed. Now, when it comes to the most plausible theory as to what caused the ship to catch fire, well, the first thing to remember is sabotage is most likely not what caused the ship to catch fire. Hugo looked into this and decided that it wasn't a plausible explanation. However, as Hugo began to investigate more and more into what caused the ship to catch fire, he believes he does have an answer to the question. And in order to properly answer the question, we have to go back and look at everything that happened to the Hindenburg during its final minutes of flight. So, to state the obvious here, yes, the reason the Hindenburg burned up so rapidly was because the hydrogen that the ship used to allow itself to fly caught fire and quickly burned up the ship. But the ultimate question is, how did this hydrogen ignite in the first place? Because for hydrogen to ignite, two things need to happen. Number one, the hydrogen needs to mix with oxygen, and number two, there needs to be an ignition source. So the only logical explanation here is that there must have been a hydrogen leak somewhere to allow the hydrogen to mix with oxygen, because it couldn't do this if the hydrogen was contained within the hydrogen bags like it was supposed to. So then, once this leak occurred, the next question is, how did the hydrogen ignite in the first place? Because just because hydrogen and oxygen are around each other, if there's no ignition source, then it's impossible for the hydrogen to catch fire, like what it did when the Hindenburg crashed. So if we go back and look at the evidence, there is enough there to suggest that yes, there was a hydrogen leak within the Hindenburg, and that it was coming from the Hindenburg stern section. The first piece of evidence to suggest this is the fact that the crew said that as they were coming into land, the Hindenburg was unusually heavy at the stern, and as a result of this, they were continuing to drop more and more water ballast from the Hindenburg stern section in an attempt to even the ship out. However, as the Hindenburg continued to lose more and more hydrogen, this effect of dropping the water ballast, well, it didn't help out for very long. The second piece of evidence to suggest that there was a hydrogen leak from the Hindenburg stern section comes from that member of the ground team who saw that strange fluttering effect happening at the top of the Hindenburg stern section during the ship's final stages of landing. It's most likely that this fluttering effect that he saw was hydrogen gas escaping through the airship. And then the final piece of evidence to suggest that there was a hydrogen leak in the stern section is it was in that part of the ship where the Hindenburg first caught fire. So that was the ignition point. So based on all of this, I can only conclude that yes, there was a hydrogen leak within the Hindenburg and that it was most definitely coming from the ship's stern section. So now that we've determined that yes, the Hindenburg was indeed leaking hydrogen, the next thing we have to answer is how did this hydrogen leak start in the first place? Well, ultimately, we can't say for certain since all the evidence burned up, but there is a running theory out there. The theory suggests that the Hindenburg started losing hydrogen during the ship's final stages of landing. And we know this because during the entire flight of the Hindenburg, the ship was operating fine. It was even operating fine while it was waiting for the all clear to land. So the ship didn't start losing hydrogen until it was in its final stages of landing. So something had to have happened around that time that caused the hydrogen leak. Now, if we dive a little further into this, we can also see that the ship started losing hydrogen after it made those final sharp turns during the ship's final landing sequence. And the running theory is that you see, the Hindenburg, where it was such a large airship, well, it wasn't designed to do sharp turns. And when the ship made these final sharp turns, well, inside the Hindenburg, there were these massive support cables that helped hold the hydrogen bags in place. And the running theory is that during one of these sharp turns, one of those cables holding the hydrogen bag there may have snapped. And then as this cable was whipping around inside of the Hindenburg, it may have slashed open one of the hydrogen bags. And this is what caused the initial hydrogen leak that eventually doomed the airship. Okay, so we've established that there was definitely a hydrogen leak inside the Hindenburg, and we even have a good theory as to how this hydrogen leak may have occurred. But now we have one more question to answer. What was the ignition source that caused the hydrogen to start burning in the first place? Well, ultimately, I think the answer to this question is bad luck. So ultimately, Hugo Echner did come up with a theory as to what he thought ignited the leaking hydrogen within the Hindenburg. And honestly, when I heard the theory, I believed it myself. I really do think it explains everything. And you see, what he ultimately thought was the trigger that ignited the hydrogen, well, you're not going to believe this, but he thinks it was static electricity. And in case you're confused about that, well, don't worry, I'll explain. During the Hindenburg's final flight across the Atlantic, the ship encountered a pretty severe storm. This storm was high in both its humidity and its electrical charge. Now, typically the Hindenburg's crew would simply take the ship and have it fly around the storm. However, they were in a hurry to reach the United States, so they decided to fly through it. Now, as a result of this could have caused the Hindenburg's outer skin to build up a bit of a static charge due to everything that was going on around the ship as it was flying through the storm. Now, eventually, when the Hindenburg reached the United States, the area that the ship was waiting in to land was also being affected by storms. So that means there is even more humidity and electrical charge in the air, and this could have caused even more of a static charge buildup on the Hindenburg's outer skin. Now, when the Hindenburg came into land and its landing ropes were dropped, this would have caused a grounding between the Hindenburg's internal framework and the ground, not the outer skin. The outer skin wouldn't have been grounded by the Hindenburg dropping the ropes. So what Hugo thinks happened was, he thinks when the internal frame of the ship was grounded by the ropes, this could have created a static spark between the ship's outer skin and the internal framework. And this is ultimately what caused the leaking hydrogen within the airship to catch fire. However, there is a problem with this theory. You see, if Hugo is right about that, well, shouldn't the ship have caught fire as soon as the landing lines were dropped? However, this isn't what happened. It took the Hindenburg another 4 minutes after the landing lines were dropped before the ship caught fire. So does this mean that Hugo is wrong and that it wasn't a static spark that caused the ship to catch fire? Well, no, it doesn't, because believe it or not, there is a simple explanation as to why it took another 4 minutes before the Hindenburg finally caught fire. When the landing ropes were initially dropped, the ropes would have been very dry, and as a result of this, the landing ropes would have been very poor conductors, so the initial grounding between the Hindenburg's internal framework and the ground may not have happened right away. However, if you remember, a very light rain began to fall while the ground crew was pulling the Hindenburg down, and this rain would have made the ropes a little bit wet, and this could have added enough of a conductivity through the ropes to allow the Hindenburg's internal framework to be grounded, and this could be what ultimately caused the static electricity discharge that ultimately doomed the Hindenburg. So yeah, ultimately, even though we will never be able to say for certain what, number one, caused the hydrogen to leak in the first place, and number two, what caused it to ignite, I really do believe that the theory we discussed in this video is ultimately what caused the ship to crash. I don't see any problems with it, and I really do think it explains everything. But after the Hindenburg disaster occurred, this basically signaled the end with the world's fascination with airships. The public simply did not want to travel on airships anymore after seeing pictures and video of the Hindenburg crashing and burning. And honestly, I don't blame them. Would you want to travel on airships after seeing pictures and video of that? I definitely wouldn't. Anyway, even though airships were not around for very long, they are still a very fascinating piece of aviation history, and I think it's important that all of us learn about them. And I also think it's important that each and every single one of us learn about the Hindenburg disaster, so the memory of all of those who were lost on that tragic day are never forgotten. Thank you guys so much for watching this video about the Hindenburg. If you enjoyed this video, please be sure to leave it a like. And if you're new here, please subscribe to the channel. Thank you guys, it really helps out a lot. Thank you guys so much for being here, and I'll see you in the next one. Have a great day, everybody. Special thanks to our captain level Patreon supporter, Tammy Lee. Thank you so much for all the support.